Good afternoon and welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, May 11th, 2021. My name is Kenton Bird and I'm the co-coordinator of this series along with my colleague Dan Buckmich from the Lionel Hampton School of Music. For those of you that are not familiar with the colloquium, it is a weekly series of presentations by faculty, emeritus faculty, graduate students, postdocs. In this case, we have a variety of visiting scholars, all contributors to a new book about Governor Phil Batt of Idaho. And I'll be introducing the presenters in just a moment. But I wanted to let the audience know that this marks the end of our 20th year. The colloquium was founded by Dan and a couple of colleagues in the fall of 2001. And we've, with just very few exceptions, has been going every week during the academic year. And we'll have a big celebration of the 20th anniversary in the fall. I recognize many names and faces of our regular attendees. This is open to the community, as well as it's offered as an undergraduate class in interdisciplinary studies. So welcome to the audience. And let me tell you a little bit about our distinguished panel today. In alphabetical order, Rod Grammer is a longtime newspaper and broadcast journalism. He studied journalism and history at the University of Idaho, where he was editor of the Argonaut, our award-winning student newspaper. And my claim to fame is that Rod hired me as a cub reporter for the Argonaut in the spring of 1973. For the last several years, Rod has served as president and CEO of Idaho Business for Education, a nonprofit group working to strengthen education in Idaho. Next is Lindy High, who I first met when she was doing media relations for the University of Idaho. She began her career as a reporter for United Press International, or UPI. She later worked for the State Board of Education, Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, and in 1995 joined the staff of Governor Phil Batt, where she served as a senior staff assistant. Mark Johnson has been a broadcast journalist and was chief of staff to former Idaho Governor Cecil Andrus, who preceded Phil Batt as governor. He is also the author of Political Hellraiser, The Life and Times of Senator Burton K. Wheeler, and Tuesday Night Massacre about the 1980 election. And he is a past presenter for the Renfrew Colloquium. Dirk Kempthorne was the 49th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Interior. Previously, he served nearly 2 terms as governor of Idaho. And before becoming governor, he was completed a successful 6-year term in the U.S. Senate. He began his commitment to public service as president of the ASUI, the Associated Students of the University of Idaho, and is recipient of an honorary degree from the University of Idaho. Randy Staples, a longtime writer of Idaho politics and history, began his reporting career at the Argonaut the year that I was editor. He's worked at newspapers in Coeur d'Alene, Lewiston, Boise, Caldwell, and Pocatello, and for many years has written a regional column on politics and government. What they all have in common is a connection with Phil Batt, the 49th governor of Idaho. Before becoming governor, Phil Batt had been a Republican politician in Idaho for 30 years, serving in the state legislature in both the House and Senate, and as the 35th lieutenant governor from 1979 to 1983. He ran for governor in 1982 and was defeated in a close race by the Democratic incumbent, John Evans, but he didn't let that stop him. He returned to the state Senate and then served on the 3-member Idaho Transportation Board, where he was appointed by Governor Cecil Andrus. He ran for governor in 1994 winning 48% of the vote in the primary, and then defeated State Attorney General Larry Echohawk in the general election, becoming the first Republican governor in 28 years. Despite his high popularity, he chose to serve only one term and was succeeded by Dirk Kempthorne. Here's how the program is going to work today. I'm going to call on each of the 5 panelists with a question to get things started. Then in the second round, it's going to be like a round robin, and each of the panelists will ask another panelist a question. And then in the third round, we'll turn it over to you, the audience, to ask questions of any or all of the panelists, as well as to share your own memories about Governor Phil Batt. And we'll begin with Rod Grammer, who is the editor of this book and also the person who was responsible for making it happen and pulling all the pieces together. So Rod, to just get us started, why don't you tell us the backstory? How did this project come about, and how did you convince Governor Batt to sit down for some long form interviews that became the heart of the book?
Ken, thank you. And thank you again for this opportunity. It's a thrill to do this, especially at our alma mater and in Governor Batt's close association with the University of Idaho. First, Ken, if I could just take a point of personal privilege to thank Dirk and Mark and Lindy and Randy for joining us today, but also for writing essays on Governor Batt for the book. Their essays really make this a rich book, and I really appreciate their support. So this book really came as an idea to me, and for full transparency, I had envisioned the book to be a joint interview between or with Governor Batt and Governor Andrus. And what motivated me was I felt like the politics, our current political situation, really stood in stark contrast to the political careers of these 2 governors, especially when it comes to bipartisanship and political friendships and civility. So I wanted to sit down with both these governors who were very close friends, political friends, and personal friends, and just talk about the current political situation. Well, unfortunately, Governor Andrus, as you know, passed away in August of 2017 before I could start the project. But I felt like Governor Batt still had a lot to say, both about his career, his life, and especially about current affairs. So that's what motivated the book, and I started. I did 3 interviews with Governor Batt in person over the course of from 2019 to 2020, just before the pandemic. And we also corresponded, and I sent him some questions, and he responded by email. So in all, we did about 3 hours worth of interviews for the book. So that's how it came about and why I did it.
Rod, did you learn anything in those interviews that surprised you, or some insight into Governor Batt's personality or motivations that perhaps you hadn't been familiar with?
Well, what struck me was how consistent Governor Batt is about his views toward the world. You know, his record on human rights, he's probably in my view, the leading voice for human rights in Idaho. And his views are so consistent on that. And, you know, it was really interesting to talk to him about how that came about. I think it was really, he credits his mother with helping him understand that every person should be treated with respect and dignity. And then when he was in the service in Mississippi, he saw Jim Crow up front and personal, and he was offended by how the African Americans were treated in Mississippi when he was stationed there. And throughout his life, he was very consistent when it came to his support for human rights. One other thing that I thought, we do break some news in this book, which I'm sure you'll probably get into with all of our essay writers. But one of the things he predicted in our very first interview in February of 2019 was that when he died, Governor Little and the other state leaders would probably change the nuclear waste agreement that he negotiated with the federal government, that he and Governor Andrus defended for almost 25 years. And sure enough, well, he predicted that they would change it after he died. He was right that they were going to change it, but they actually changed it about 8 months after he told me that. So he was very much alive. But the other thing that I would say, Kenton, is that how I was also struck by how much he has stayed up on current affairs. He had really strong opinions about the current political situation. He was very dismayed at the lack of civility in our politics, very dismayed at the lack of bipartisanship and the tone of politics in especially nationally at the time. He was very, very concerned about that. So how he, and he was very up to date on some of the issues that are burning here in Idaho as well.
Let's turn next to Randy. You write in your essay in the book that Batt's one term as governor was half as many as it should have been. Can you elaborate on that? Why do you think he deserved a second term, and why didn't he seek re-election?
Well, it seemed to me as I was watching his governorship through the 4 years that he kept getting better as he went along. I might have thought that given the large number of years that he'd had in and around Idaho government, a lot of years in the legislature and the transportation board and other places, just becoming extremely familiar with Idaho government, that what we saw in the first just right away was what we were going to get. I think that he kind of worked his way into it. He obviously took it very, very seriously. He wanted to be very careful in what he did. So I think that he was working at it, trying to figure out how best to be a governor as he went. And as time went on, he learned more, and I think he got better at it. I think he was a better governor in his second year than he was in the first. He was a better governor than that in his third, and he was getting, to me, really good at it in the fourth year. And then he said he wasn't going to do another term. I think that the state would have gotten some really good benefit from a second term of Phil Batt. He was onto some good projects. He was moving into some very useful areas. I think he had a lot more to contribute, and it's you can never say that somebody owes it to us to serve in a position like that. He was ready to depart, and that's fair enough. But I think the state would have gained something significant out of a second term.
Let's go to Governor Kempthorne for a follow-up to that. And in your essay, you describe a surprise visit to your Boise home by Governor Batt after he decided not to run for re-election. And you write, Phil told me at that time, I, meaning Dirk, needed to come home and be a candidate for governor. So how influential was that conversation in your decision to leave the U.S. Senate, where you easily could have been reelected, and come home to Idaho to run for governor?
And first, thanks for this opportunity. And then Rod, congratulations on getting that book done. It's going to be a magnificent book, well received. So Kenton, you can well imagine if you were sitting in your home, it's early morning hours, you're putting notes and things together as you're about ready to start your day. There's a knock on the door. You're not expecting anybody. And so you go to the door figuring it's a friend or maybe it's a neighbor. And lo and behold, you open the door and the governor of the state is standing there, a gentleman that you have the greatest respect for. And he says, we need to talk. I said, please, Governor, come in. And anyway, that was the setting where that discussion took place. I happen to agree with Randy. I did everything I could the weeks leading up to that to try to convince him he needed a second term. There had been a book that had just been written. It was a biography of George Washington, extremely well done. I bought that, and probably 1 or 2 months before that morning meeting I had with Phil Batt, I took it to him in his office, and I inscribed on the front page, took the entire page, but how much he had accomplished. And like George Washington, who had a second term, I said, you, Phil, need a second term to fulfill the total vision you have for this great state. Many of us could not move him from that decision, and so we have to respect that.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and I was not aware of the way that he had reached out to you to convince you to run for governor. And as they say, the rest is history. So,
well, I mean, again, no one was with him, just standing there, and it was a very serious, sober conversation.
Well, Lindy, among all of the panelists, you actually were on the governor's staff. You worked close with him for 4 years. Can you talk a little bit about you describe him as a man of contradictions. Could you give us some examples of some of the paradoxes in his personality and temperament, and particularly any differences between the public persona and the private person that you saw inside the office? And you need to unmute, please. There we go. Okay, great. Yep.
Well, his contradictions are things like he talked a lot about small and efficient government, which some people interpreted as being anti-state employees, and yet he took the time to visit every single state agency. If there were only 4 people in that agency, he would go ahead and visit with them. No agenda, just wanted to hear what they thought. He was in public very frugal about the state's money, but personally he was so generous. And sometimes people would write with these hard luck stories, and he'd actually send a check to somebody to buy a Christmas gift for their kids, or in one case, buy some clothing. He seemed to be tough on crime. He liked to say, you do the crime, you do the time. And yet personally, he would always seem to want to give people a second chance. And then we all talked about his temper. Governor Kempthorne, I really liked your essay in there about your dreaded Monday mornings. And I felt that as well. But when he was over it, he was done. It didn't linger. There wasn't any trial period, or, I remember what you did. He'd lose his temper, and then he just was totally over. You didn't hear about it anymore. When I was working for him, I don't remember the topic one day, but I said to him in his office, well, I'm not the most conservative person on your staff. And he started to laugh about it. And I said, okay, let's just admit I'm the most liberal person in this wing of the State House. And he said, you're going to be surprised in the end how often we agree. And we really did, because so many of his decisions were based on common sense and research and a deep thought process. So those were his contradictions. He was a great guy to work for.
Well, now we're moving into the second round, and this is a chance for the panelists to ask questions of each other. And we're going to do this in the same sequence that they spoke initially. So the first question is Rod to ask of Randy. So go ahead, Rod.
Well, this is a treat to be able to turn tables on Randy and ask him a question. So Randy, one of the things I was so compelled, found so compelling in your essay was you recounted the story about Donald Paradis. And many of us in journalism remember his alleged crime, high profile. He was on death row. And the decision came to Governor Batt's desk on whether to sign his death certificate to execute him. Tell the listeners about that Donald Paradis episode, because I think it says so much about who Governor Batt was or is as a man and a statesman.
Well, I think it does. And statesman, it's a good demonstration of what sort of a statesman he was. The Paradis case was well known in the state. I think there were a lot of people in Idaho who would have been of the mind to just string him up. Well, there were some real questions about not whether he was involved at all in the murder that took place, but what his role was. And when the time came to decide whether to let the execution proceed or not, which in the end was the governor's decision, Phil Batt had to decide what to do. Now, I can imagine a number of political people. I can think of some in state houses around the country today who would probably have simply said, the judicial system is operated. The popular thing to do is to just go ahead and be done with the guy and let the execution proceed, and that's going to be the end of it. There are any number of people for whom that would have been the easy thing to do, and it would have been the politic thing to do. It would have been the thing that that would have had plenty of people around this state or other states saying, yeah, justice is served. Well, for Phil Batt, it was not that simple. He took the responsibility very seriously. He spent, as I understand it, upwards of a week just clearing his calendar, talking to people involved in the case, looking back at the files, looking back at all the information he could get a hold of, trying to figure out what exactly it was that happened, what we knew and what we didn't know, not just whether a conviction had been made, but what the level of proof was, what the level of culpability was, where justice really lay in this case. And what he came up with is that this was somebody who was involved, who was not really an innocent, but by no means ought to be, with the information in hand, ought to be executed. And he did the difficult thing, the hardworking thing of going after that and deciding that no, this was not going to happen. He put that off. And ultimately, as time went on, more information came out and his decision on that was vindicated.
Mark, I realized that I skipped over you in the first round. So while Randy is thinking of a question for Governor Kempthorne, I'm going to go back to Mark and ask you to talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between Cecil Andrus and Phil Batt. And in what ways were they alike, and in what ways or what issues might they have disagreed upon?
I thought maybe there for a moment, Kenton, that I didn't have my UI credential front and center, so you passed right over me. First, thank you for putting this together, and congratulations to my old pal Rod Grammer for pulling off this project. Governor Kempthorne is exactly right. It's a great contribution to Idaho political history, and congratulations, Rod. Well, I have a little bit different perspective, I think, on Phil. First, from the standpoint of covering him as a reporter, as some of us did back in those days. He was a very good legislator, as I remember, and a very good president pro tem of the state Senate for a while in the 70s. And then later on, had the opportunity to sort of observe the Andrus-Batt relationship more closely when both of them were out of office. And your question, Kenton, was, how are they alike or not? And I actually think, obviously, there were some stylistic and personality differences, but fundamentally, they approached the job very much the same way. They were creatures of the legislature where they had gotten to know each other well. They understood the legislative process. They understood the fact that successful governors have control of the state budget. They really know where the bones are buried in the state agencies and in their budgets. Detail oriented. I think they both really were that. So from a standpoint of how they approached the job, I think they were very similar in the way they approached the job. And, it's hard to analyze somebody else's friendship from afar, but I was telling somebody a couple of days ago in anticipation of this today that they really did have a friendship that transcended their political relationship. And they, had genuine regard for each other. I had the pleasure of, on more than a few occasions, to play golf with the two of them. And it was an absolute joy to be around the two of them because, they both had great senses of humor. They were poking fun at each other all the time and at each other. They were extremely competitive on the golf course and everywhere else. Everything was a wager. So they really had a personal relationship that transcended their political relationship. And the proof of that, I think, is in the nuclear waste agreement, which, despite the ill-considered decisions to change it in some respects, in my judgment, is a real major accomplishment that Phil deserves a place in the history books for that agreement, if for no other reason. And he really inherited that set of issues from Andrus, and to his enduring credit, he picked it up, mastered the details of a very complicated issue, and with a lot of support from Andrus and a lot of encouragement back and forth, they really cemented something that I think is going, even though it's been changed, continues to redound to the benefit of Idaho. So again, thanks, Rod, for putting it together, because Phil deserves the recognition, and it was a real pleasure to have an opportunity to contribute to it.
Governor Kempthorne has a great golf story in his essay, and I'm not going to give away the punchline, but I would encourage those of you who buy and read the book to check that out. So we're going to go next to Randy and let you offer a question to Governor Kempthorne.
Okay, first I'd like to add to the comments that other people have made toward Rod in getting this book together. This was a very good project to do. This does add still further to our understanding of how politics has worked and what the people were like going back a few years in Idaho political history, and I think that's very valuable. Governor, I was reading your essay on Phil Batt, and really enjoyed the section of where you were talking about serving as his campaign manager in 1982, I believe. There were some good stories in there, but I guess I had two questions kind of coming out of it. One question is, it always interests me to try to put together what we expect out of somebody after they're elected from the perspective we get before. So my question would be, when looking back now at what Phil Batt was like as governor, is that more or less what you expected when you were running his campaign for governor in 1982? And my second question is, there was a 12-year stretch in between, and this, I guess, would require some real speculation. But do you think that stretch in between, that period that ran in between when he first ran for governor, had time to think about it, and then wound up serving as governor, did that maybe have some effect or change on the way he wound up executing the office, serving as governor?
Yeah. And Randy, I have to say, this is like deja vu. I mean, here's the Argonaut reporter asking the student body president another question.
Goes back a long way.
Yeah. Really good questions. And I'm going to tag onto what you said moments ago about the case that Phil, as governor, looked at. You remember, he announced he was a committee of one. So rather than establishing some very fine jurists or whoever, he took the entire responsibility on and said up front, this would be a committee of one. I always respect that. You ask what he would have been like if what I saw as a candidate would transfer to being the governor. Yes, because I think, and I sense this from Lindy, and I'm going to ask her a question in a moment, but he was so thorough in his thinking, studious, that I remember there was a point in time of that election with John Evans where it looked as though Phil Batt was going to be declared the winner. And I will tell you, at that moment, rather than Phil having this joyous celebration and boy, we did it, he said, all right, we need to get right down to this. And he named some entities that had been opposing his candidacy and said, I want to meet with them immediately because we need to start putting this state back together. So it shows you his civility. He was not a harsh partisan. I think we all realize that. And that served the state very well. And then that 12-year period, I think maybe like a fine wine, it just kept getting better as he recollected the number of years he had served in the different capacities, watching what had transpired, but then saying, if I do get that chance to be the governor, the CEO of this state, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to accomplish. And he said about it, I think, very, very effectively. And that's why I too wish there'd have been a second term. And thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Governor, now you get to put on your reporter's cap and ask a question of a former reporter, but also longtime state government employee, Lindy High.
Yeah, Lindy, it's so good to see you again. So let's cut through all of the policy stuff and let's talk about the person, because you got to see Phil Batt, as I did, in those moments when it might have been just the two of you in the office, he's dealing with an issue. He was mercurial. Boy, he had a temper. But before the day was over, you received his condolences and in his arm saying, come on, I didn't mean that. So also in the essay I wrote, I talk about the time that we traveled across Eastern Idaho, and for 1 hour, he told me every joke he had, and I had to judge whether they were good or not. So tell us about Phil Batt, the man that you got to know, Lindy.
Well, he had a generous personality, I guess. I want to add a coda to Randy's story about the Donald Paradis case, because this says something about that. The attorney who represented Donald Paradis during that week where both sides were talking to the governor was Bill Mock. And Bill Mock had been chairman of the state Democratic Party and had been critical of Governor Batt from time to time. And so I think there were probably some people who assumed that Governor Batt would rule against Donald Paradis because, you know, for political reasons. And I think it shows how really open-minded he was, that in the end, he decided as long as there was any question about Donald Paradis, he could not sign the execution form. He was funny. He was kind. He was really inclusive about staff. He didn't shut himself off. When he had a meeting with someone that involved the area that I was working in, he always made sure that I was included in that meeting. He had an interesting sense of history, and he would talk about things that had happened in his career. You know, I could just tell you lots of stories, but the main thing is he'd been in politics for a long time, and it was fun to listen to him. And then just as kind of a personal, this is a personal story. When he ran for pro tem of the state Senate, the person he ran against was my father-in-law, Richard High. And Batt, of course, won the election, as we all know. And a few days later, he came walking out of the State House chambers and across the foyer and went to the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee offices where my father-in-law had his office. And someone said he wanted to talk to Senator High about something. And instead of summoning Dick to his office, he went over there to talk to someone he wanted to talk to. And I think that says a lot about the kind of person Phil Batt is.
Great example.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Lindy. And now you can put on your UPI reporter's role again and turn now to Mark Johnson with a question.
Yeah, hi, Mark. I
Hi,
still
Lindy.
love your library.
Thank you.
When I joined Governor Batt's staff, you sent me a nice note. I don't know if you remember it, but you congratulated me for getting the job. And you said you're going to find out how often this is like drinking from a fire hose. And I wonder if you think Governor Andrus could have written a similar note to Governor Batt. What were the things about governing a state that you think Andrus might have said? He certainly had more experience than anyone else.
Well, that's a great question, Lindy. I suspect that note probably did happen, or maybe a telephone conversation took place. I don't know for sure, but I think I know the two individuals well enough to know that there was some communication going on there. As I reflect back on that period of the transition between Andrus's leaving office and Phil coming in, I think there was no concern at all in Cease Andrus's mind that he was handing over the governor's office to somebody who was up to the job. And Andrus used to joke that people remembered him at the end of his career, not when he was a greenhorn 39-year-old governor in 1971, when he didn't know, by his own admission, which way was up about a lot of things. So I think he really did share insights with Phil, particularly around the nuclear waste agreement and his desire to, kind of cement a relationship between the state of Idaho and the Department of Energy that would endure. So they had a lot of communication. I think, and I think I said this in my little essay for Rod's book, that the highest compliment that Cease Andrus could pay to anyone was that he was a person of his word. That you could, if they said they were going to do something, you could take it to the bank, they were going to do it. If they wouldn't promise something that they weren't able to deliver. And he always said that about Phil, that he had absolute confidence in his integrity, knew that he could trust him. And so, yeah, I think they must have compared notes about a lot of things, often, while they were poking each other with a sharp stick at a tee box on a golf course someplace.
Thank you, Mark, for that response. Thank you, Lindy, for the question. And now, Mark, do you have a question for Rod?
I've been waiting 40 years to ask a question of Rod Grammer. Let's see. Rod, every politician will say, well, I'm not concerned about my legacy. The historians will write whatever they will write about me. But I think every politician cares about their legacy. They may not admit it, but they want to be remembered in a certain way and for certain things. What's your sense about what Phil's legacy should be?
Great question, Mark. And I, without being explicit about it, I think Governor Batt is mindful of his legacy. I think one thing that we haven't touched on very much in this conversation is Governor Batt's humility. Governor Batt is for a politician especially, he's one of the most humble people that I've ever known. And that humility continues to this day. When he received that highest medal of honor from Governor Otter for citizenship, he was truly humbled by that and told me in my interview, he said, I don't know why I received that. I'm a politician. There are so many other people that should have received that. So first thing I'd say, he's very humble. But I would say that what he's most proud of by far is the work he did for human rights. In fact, in the interview, he even said that is something that he is very proud of, is his work for human rights. And as I mentioned in the opening comments, I know of no other Idaho statesperson who championed human rights like Governor Batt did. And in this day and age where diversity and inclusion and all these issues are denigrated so much, Governor Batt stands out as a true hero in my book and champion for that. I think the other thing that he's very proud of is the nuclear waste deal. That wasn't easy. And as you know, there were elements in Idaho that didn't think it was the right agreement. But he took that to the people of Idaho because he had faith in the people of Idaho, and they gave him a resounding support for that agreement, which he and Governor Andrus then defended for the next quarter century. So I think he's very proud of that. But I will say something. He's too humble to actually say this, so I'll say it. I think his legacy is also integrity. I have always said that the two political figures that I've always admired for their honesty and their integrity are Frank Church, who I had the privilege of co-authoring his biography, and Phil Batt. I think Phil had the highest degree of integrity and honesty, both as a political leader, but also as a person. His ability to admit when he was wrong, and he admitted that a few times in our interview that he had been wrong. He said, you'll appreciate this, Mark. He said he was very doubtful about kindergarten, but Cease really wanted his vote for kindergartens or for kindergarten. And he said in my interview, he said, Cease was right and I was wrong on that issue. And so I think his ability to admit when he's wrong, his ability to apologize to people when he's wronged them, and just his general integrity as a person and as a political leader. I think those are the three things that he will be most remembered for.
I'd like to go around one more time with the panelists, but I think there are probably some questions or comments from the audience, and I would invite anybody who would like to speak to either put your hand up on camera or use the hand up function in Zoom, and we can hear from our diverse and very well-informed audience. And while our audience is thinking of their question or comment, Rod, maybe you could tell us a little bit about where to buy the book or how to order it online, and also where the proceeds will go.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, the book literally just came off the presses. I picked up my copies of it last week at Caxton Printers. And I want to thank Scott Gibson and Caxton for publishing it. I took the very first copy to Governor Batt last Thursday and personally gave it to him. And he and I had a chance to sort of go through it. And you could tell that he was tremendously touched by it. I mean, I could see the emotion in his eyes and his face. The book is currently available at caxtonprinters.com or at Amazon, but it'll soon be in the bookshops in Idaho and other bookshops, Book People there in Moscow, Rediscovered Books here in Boise. So very soon you can buy it in one of the bookshops, but you can get it right now at Amazon and also at caxtonprinters.com. And I just want to say that all the proceeds of this book are going to go to the Wasserman Center for Human Rights. And in my dedication of the book, I dedicated the book to all the people in Idaho who fight tirelessly for human rights in our state, our great state. And I just think it was fitting, very fitting, that all the proceeds of it would go to further education around how important human rights are. I think Governor Batt really appreciated that. And I hope my fellow essay writers appreciate that that's where the proceeds are going to go to.
I have a question from my colleague, Glenn Mosley, who teaches broadcast news and is the editor of Idaho Public Radio Reports. And Glenn wonders, could the speakers address Governor Batt's relationship with the press as a legislator, as party chair, and as governor? And Linda, you're chuckling. I'm going to let you go first with that.
Well, the reason I'm laughing is that he got me out of my office one day and had me follow him down to the State House basement where the press offices were. And we went into the Associated Press office, and he confronted Bob Fick because he thought that Bob had used the wrong version of the word peak. He'd either used P-E-E-K when he should have used P-E-A-K, or vice versa. And I don't remember which one. And so he kind of chewed on Bob for a while about using the wrong word. And then as we were going back to the office, he said, it just piqued my curiosity. He was a nice wordsmith.
Oh, that's great.
Kenton, could I take a crack at that question?
Sure, Mark.
And Glenn, thank you for the question. I am old enough to remember when Phil used to come down to the press center in the State House during the legislative session. Now, this may have been when he was lieutenant governor. Jim Fisher was covering the legislature for the Tribune at that time. And Jim almost always had a bottle of something in the bottom desk drawer of his desk. And at least once a week or once every 10 days, Phil would come down at the end of the day, and several of us would gather around, and the glasses would come out and we'd have a drink, and it was all off the record. I don't think anybody ever misused any information that came out of those chats, but Phil was remarkably candid, always funny. He had the latest dope on what lobbyist was, misbehaving with what attaché or whatever was the gossip in the Capitol at the particular time. And I think he really, really enjoyed that. And now the flip side of that is, as has been suggested before, if he thought you were, violating some ethical rule about asking a question that was a little off topic or off color or whatever, he could come right back down your throat and could be pretty aggressive about it. But I think generally he liked mixing it up with the press quite a bit, and he was a great source. I mean, he was very candid in telling reporters what was going on.
And
Ken,
I'd like to share.
if I could add a couple of quick things.
Randy first and then Rod.
Oh, okay. One is Kenton, during the time when you were editor there, that was when I first had my first encounter with Phil Batt, because something had come up related to the university that the Argonaut needed a legislative comment on, and Phil Batt, who I had not heard of previously, was who we needed to contact. So I decided I tried to get him on the phone, and I did. I was a little surprised, first of all, that I was able to get to him. He was the pro tem, or he was the majority leader, I think, at the time. But I did. We had a good conversation. He was concise but perfectly helpful, and I thanked him, and I've borne that in mind ever since. The other thing that came to mind was that with connection with this is that Phil was kind of a journalist himself. He wrote a newspaper column for a long time, and his columns were often very funny. They were sometimes political, but more often than not, they were just funny. And he had actually done two books. One was his general memoir, but then he also did a second book, which was kind of a collection of columns, and the title of it was "My Life as a Geezer," and may give a little bit of indication about what sort of a writer he was.
So Ken, I have two things about Phil when I was still in journalism. The first is everybody's touched on his temper, and I was actually the recipient of that once. when I was executive news director at KTVB Channel 7, I had been invited by a member of the Arid Club to attend club night. And that's when, almost every member of the Arid Club is there. The club is kind of closed otherwise. And so a lot of people there in the main lobby of the Arid Club. And I can't even remember the story now, but my staff had done a story that on the evening news that evening that Phil didn't like. And I was standing there talking to some folks, and Phil saw me across the room, and he made a beeline to me right there in front of the entire Air Club and just chewed me out really well. So I was on the receiving end of his ire. The other thing is that when I moderated the Viewpoint program, I would prepare maybe 15 questions for a guest. But when Phil was on, I always prepared at least 30 questions because he always answered questions with yes, no, maybe 3-word sentences. And to stretch a half-hour program, I had to have a whole arsenal of questions to ask Phil because he is a man of very few words. That's for darn sure. Same thing happened, by the way, in the 3-hour interviews I did with him for this book. He was the same old Phil. I really had to prepare a lot of questions for him.
So, Governor, I don't know if you had the chance to observe Governor Batt in any of his interactions with the press, but anything that you can add to this series of stories?
And I would just say I'm envious of Rod that he was the target only once. Every Monday, I was the target. So, boy, I've been there. And I would I'll give a kudo to Rod, and that is, Rod, you're the author. It's your book on Phil Batt, but you were gracious to invite so many of us to add to it with the essay. And I think that's a great touch because it really fills out the dimension of this whole story of who Phil Batt is.
We have a question from one of our interdisciplinary students, Sky Northcutt. And Sky, if you want to go ahead and ask away.
Yeah, I think you all have spoken really beautiful as to who Phil Batt was as a statesman. Could any of you speak to his life after his retirement from politics?
Great question. Rod, do you want to start with that?
Well, my biggest contact with Phil after he left office has really been in the last two and a half years working on this book. And I will say, Governor Batt, his first wife, Jackie, passed away. His second wife, this tells me so much about Idaho. His second wife is Francie Riley, and their relationship is a beautiful, beautiful relationship. They are so happy, and Francie is such a wonderful, wonderful person. And the reason I say this tells you a lot about Idaho and Idaho politics is that Francie is a Riley. And if that name is familiar, her brother was Terry Riley, who was a Democratic state senator and then ran for lieutenant governor in 1986, and then fortunately was killed in a plane crash campaigning for lieutenant governor. So here's Phil Batt, a lion of the Republican Party, who marries into one of the most prominent Democratic families in Idaho. And they are so happy. I can just tell you that Governor Batt, he's 94. His health is failing. His mind is sharp. But Francie and Eva Gay Yost are taking such good care of him. The other thing I will say, then I'll pass the baton on to the others, is that during the first two interviews, Governor Batt's golden retriever, Sully, sat at his feet. And after our second interview in 2019, or whenever that was, Sully passed away. And Francie told me last week when I was over at their house that almost every day Governor Batt continues to mourn the loss of that dog. He really loved that dog, and as you know, he loved all kinds of animals. But I just want to tell you that he's doing well, but his health is slipping, and we're very lucky to still have him with us. That's for sure.
Kenton, could I just add, first of all, Sky, good for you as a student to ask a question. You got a bright future ahead of you. But whenever you are with Phil Batt, he has something kind to say to you. And I would also say, you mustn't forget his love of music. He was a clarinet player, an excellent musician. He and Gene Harris would do a lot of things together. So I think music is very much a part of his life. And they're a very close-knit family. The Batt family are close-knit, and they celebrate one another very beautifully.
Hey, Kenton.
Mark, yes, please.
No one's mentioned one aspect of Phil's life and personality that I think is really important. And one of the things that I have always found really interesting about him is his music. He was a pretty accomplished jazz musician. Used to play, his clarinet with Gene Harris down at the Idaho when that was the place to be on a Tuesday night in Boise. And he was really quite an accomplished musician. He loved music, and he was also, I would say, in a way that is not very common in people in political life, he was a bit of a Renaissance man. The fact that he could write humor columns, that he wrote a couple of books, that he could play an instrument or two. This is a full life. It's just not a political life. It's a full life.
And Mark, if I could just jump in, really, something you said just sparked something I'd like to comment on. And Lindy helped me understand this. He wrote a poem for the miners that lost their lives in the Sunshine mining disaster, which is inscribed on a statue memorializing those miners. And I have to say, I'm not an expert on poetry, but I have to say that poem is one of the most beautiful poems I've ever read. If anybody ever gets a chance to Google that or read that, it was phenomenally written. Someone who cares about writing, cares about the use of words. That was a remarkable poem. And like you said, Mark, he really was is a Renaissance man, and that poem really demonstrates that.
I'm glad that Governor Kempthorne and Mark mentioned the musical connection, because one of my favorite memories of Phil Batt is on stage of the Kibbe Dome with Lionel Hampton during one of the Lionel Hampton jazz festivals. And I don't know if Lionel really recognized that he was playing along with the governor of Idaho, but it sure was fun to see the two of them together. And I appreciate the references to Phil Batt as a Renaissance man, because our colloquium series honors Malcolm Renfrew, longtime professor of chemistry, a musician, a watercolorist, and had an interest in the life of the University of Idaho. And I can think of no better way to wrap up the 20th season of the colloquium with some stories about another Renaissance man. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us. This was terrific. I don't think we've ever had 5 panelists at once. But thank you, Rod, for your efforts in putting together the book. And I hope that those of you in the audience will take an opportunity to order it. It's a quick read, but well worth the time. And as we conclude this year's colloquium series, I'd like to invite those of you in the audience to turn on your cameras and give a virtual round of applause to our panel, or to just put that old Zoom hand up. It's been wonderful to see familiar faces both on the panel and in the audience. Randy, Rod, Lindy, Mark, and Governor Kempthorne, I hope you can all join us again. You're always welcome on Tuesdays at 12:30 to join us. And we'll be having some exciting programs in the fall to mark the 20th anniversary. So thank you again for being with us today. With this, we conclude the 20th year of the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium. Happy summer to all. Stay well, stay safe, and go Vandals.
Go Vandals. Good job, Ken.